This happened during my final year of graduate school, back in the fall of 2021. I was working toward a master's degree while juggling a part-time job at a local accounting firm, so my schedule was packed almost every day of the week. Most mornings started before sunrise, and most nights ended with me buried in textbooks somewhere on campus. The university library quickly became my second home. Unlike the newer study buildings, the library stayed open until 1 in the morning during midterm and final season. It was the only place on campus where I could usually find complete silence, especially after 10 p.m. when most students had already gone home. The building itself was old. It had been expanded several times over the decades, and because of that, the layout never made much sense. Some floors connected by wide-open staircases, while others had narrow hallways that ended in isolated study rooms hidden behind rows of bookshelves. The upper floor was always my favorite. Almost nobody studied there. There weren't any group tables or computers, just long shelves filled with archived journals and individual wooden desks tucked between them. It was exactly the kind of place where you could lose track of time. One Thursday evening, I arrived around 8:30 p.m. carrying my laptop, a backpack full of notes, and enough coffee to keep me awake until closing. There were still a handful of students scattered throughout the building, but by 11 p.m. the library had become almost completely empty. The silence was incredible. Every now and then I'd hear the distant squeak of a rolling book cart or the elevator opening somewhere below, but otherwise there was nothing. Around 11:15 p.m. I noticed someone sitting 3 tables away. I hadn't seen him arrive. He looked to be in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a gray jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. What struck me wasn't that he was there. It was that he wasn't reading anything. No books, no laptop, no notebook. He simply sat there, looking down at the table with both hands folded in front of him. I figured he was just taking a break. Everyone zones out once in a while during long study sessions. I went back to reviewing practice problems. About 20 minutes later, I got up to stretch my legs and refill my water bottle. When I returned, the man was gone. His chair was neatly pushed in. I sat back down and kept working. But almost immediately, I noticed something lying beside my notebook, a folded piece of yellow paper. I was certain it hadn't been there before. Curious, I unfolded it. Inside, written in neat block letters, were 6 words. "You should study somewhere brighter." I looked around. The entire floor was empty. I assumed another student had left it as some strange joke. I crumpled the paper, threw it away, and continued my work. About an hour passed without anything unusual happening. Midnight came and went. I was so focused on studying that I barely noticed the lights flicker overhead. Then my phone buzzed with a campus safety notification. The library would be closing in 30 minutes. As I packed away one of my textbooks, I heard footsteps approaching slowly along the aisle behind me. I expected to see a librarian making final rounds. Instead, the aisle was empty. The footsteps stopped. Thinking I'd imagined them, I sat back down. A few seconds later, one bookshelf over, I heard the unmistakable sound of a book sliding off a shelf. It landed with a dull thud. I walked around the corner expecting to find a fallen book. Instead, I found 3. They were arranged neatly on the carpet in a straight line. All 3 had been pulled from different shelves. Their titles caught my attention immediately. Missing persons, campus security procedures, emergency building exits. A chill ran through me. I glanced toward the end of the aisle. No one was there. Trying to convince myself someone was playing a stupid prank, I returned the books to their shelves. As I turned to leave, I noticed another folded yellow note resting on my chair. This one contained only a single sentence. "He knows you keep staying until closing." I looked over both shoulders so fast I nearly dropped my backpack. The entire upper floor remained silent, empty, except far beyond the last row of shelves, I heard one slow footstep, then another, and another, moving steadily toward me. The footsteps continued at an unhurried pace. They weren't loud. If anything, that made them worse. Each one echoed softly against the wooden floor before disappearing into the silence. I couldn't see anyone. The shelves were tall enough that whoever was walking could remain completely hidden until they reached the end of the aisle. I grabbed my backpack without taking my eyes off the opening between the bookcases. Another step, then another. Finally, the sound stopped. The silence that followed felt almost unbearable. I waited for someone to appear. Nobody did. I slowly walked toward the aisle where I'd heard the footsteps, telling myself it was probably a librarian. The aisle was empty. Every shelf stood perfectly still. I let out a nervous laugh to calm myself and turned to head back to my desk. That's when I noticed my backpack. It wasn't where I'd picked it up. It was sitting neatly on my chair again. I knew I'd been holding it. For a split second, I questioned my own sanity. I reached for it. The zipper was open. Inside, resting on top of my notebook, was another folded yellow piece of paper. My hands immediately started shaking as I unfolded it. "Don't use the east stairwell." A loud chime echoed through the building. The announcement came over the speaker, stating that the library would close in 10 minutes and asking everyone to make their way toward the main entrance. I slung my backpack over one shoulder and headed toward the elevators. When I reached them, the call button didn't light up. A handwritten sign taped beside the doors caught my eye. "Out of service, please use stairs." The nearest staircase was the east stairwell. I stopped walking. "Don't use the east stairwell." I shook my head, trying to stay rational, but I chose the west stairwell instead. It added a couple of extra minutes to the walk, but I didn't care. As I stepped into the stairwell, I immediately noticed how freezing cold it felt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I began walking down. One flight, then another. Halfway to the second floor, I heard a heavy metal door slam somewhere below. The sound echoed violently through the concrete walls. I froze. A few seconds later came footsteps. Someone was climbing the stairs. Slowly, deliberately. There was no conversation, no phone, no jingling keys, just footsteps, coming upward, toward me. My pulse shot through the roof. Without thinking, I stepped quietly onto the landing and looked through the narrow window of the second floor door. The reading area was empty. I slipped out of the stairwell and gently let the door close behind me. The footsteps in the stairs continued. They never sped up. Whoever was climbing never called out, never made another sound. I hurried across the second floor toward the central lobby. As soon as I rounded the corner, relief washed over me. 2 librarians were standing behind the desk preparing to lock up. One of them looked up and asked if I was all right. I must have looked terrified. I explained everything. The strange man, the notes, and the footsteps. The librarian exchanged a concerned look with her coworker and quietly asked me to describe the man. I told them he wore a gray jacket, a baseball cap, looked older than most students, and had no books. She immediately picked up the phone and called campus security. While we waited, another employee checked the security cameras. After several minutes, she frowned. She replayed the footage from the 4th floor and said it was odd. There I was, walking to my desk, studying, getting water. But the chair 3 tables away, the one where I clearly saw the man sitting, had been completely empty the entire evening. I felt sick. I insisted that I saw him and that he was right there. Security arrived within minutes. 2 officers searched every floor of the building while another stayed with us. Almost 20 minutes later, they returned. They hadn't found anyone. But just as I started wondering if stress had finally gotten to me, one of the officers approached, holding something inside a clear evidence bag. It was a stack of yellow paper, exactly like the notes. He told us they found them tucked behind a vent near the 4th floor archives. There had to be at least 30 sheets. Some had handwritten messages. "Don't go alone. He waits until midnight. Use the other stairs." And one note simply read, "I tried to warn them." The officers searched the ventilation space where the papers had been hidden. Behind it, they discovered something even stranger. A narrow maintenance passage that wasn't shown on the public floor plans. It connected several storage areas behind the bookshelves. Someone could move between sections of the library without ever being seen. The passage had obviously been used recently. There were food wrappers, empty water bottles, blankets, and a flashlight. Whoever had been living inside had left only minutes before security arrived. They never caught the person. Campus police reviewed weeks of surveillance footage, but couldn't identify exactly when anyone entered or left the hidden passageways. The library closed the entire 4th floor for renovations a few days later. Officially, the university blamed outdated infrastructure. Unofficially, students began talking. Apparently, several people had reported finding strange handwritten notes over the years. I finished the semester without ever returning to that floor. A few months later, I received an email from campus security. They wanted to let me know the maintenance passages had been permanently sealed. No evidence suggested anyone had returned. That should have brought me peace of mind. Instead, it only raised one question I still can't answer. If the hidden passage had been sealed for decades before the renovations, how had someone been getting inside? Even now, years later, whenever I study somewhere quiet and hear a slow footstep behind me, I instinctively look over my shoulder. Part of me still expects to find another folded yellow note waiting on the desk. And every time I leave a library, no matter how late it is, I always take the west stairwell. This happened during the winter of 2018, when I was working evenings at a small public library in northern Michigan. I had been there for almost a year by then. It was not a glamorous job, but I genuinely enjoyed it. Most people picture libraries as quiet places where nothing interesting ever happens. And for the most part, they are right. 99% of my shifts were spent shelving books, helping people find what they were looking for, checking items in and out, and reminding teenagers that whispering still counted as talking. It was peaceful. The library itself had been standing since the late 1950s. It was not especially large, but it had 3 levels. The main floor held the circulation desk, computers, and the most popular books. The second floor contained study rooms and local history archives, while the basement stored old records that had not been touched in years. The basement always made people uncomfortable. It was not because anything bad had happened there. It was simply old. The ceiling pipes rattled whenever the heat came on. The lights buzzed constantly. And there were long aisles packed with dusty shelves that seemed to stretch forever. The public was not allowed down there. Only employees had access. Most evenings I worked with 2 librarians until 7, after which I usually finished the final 2 hours by myself. Closing the building had become routine. I would lock the front doors at 8, make one last walk through every floor, switch off unnecessary lights, and spend another 30 minutes shelving returned books before heading home. Nothing exciting ever happened, at least not until one Tuesday in December. That afternoon, the outdoor book return had been unusually full. Snow had been falling since early morning, so most people were returning books without coming inside. As I emptied the metal return bin, one particular hardcover caught my attention. It was not from our library. The cover was faded almost completely white, and there was not a barcode anywhere on it. Instead, a yellowing paper lab, spine with faded typewritten letters just stating property of Hawthorne County Library. I had never heard of Hawthorne County. Curious, I searched our statewide catalog. Nothing. No library system by that name existed. I assumed it had probably closed decades ago. When I opened the book, something slipped onto the desk. It was a library checkout card, the old-fashioned kind with handwritten names and due dates. Every line had been crossed out except the final one. There was only a first name, Emily. No return date, no stamp, just the name. I set the card aside and carried on working. By the time we closed, I had completely forgotten about it. Around 8:15, I started shelving the final stack of returns. The mysterious book had no call number, so I left it behind the circulation desk to deal with later. While I was shelving books upstairs, I heard the familiar metallic sound of the outdoor return slot opening. A sharp clunk, then another clunk. Someone was returning books after closing. Pretty normal. People did it every night. I continued shelving for another few minutes before heading downstairs. As I walked past the front desk, I glanced toward the return card. My stomach tightened. The white hardcover was sitting on top of the pile. I frowned. I could have sworn I had left it behind the desk. Thinking I must have absent-mindedly placed it back in the cart, I picked it up again. The checkout card slid out once more. This time, there was another name beneath Emily's. The ink looked fresh, reading Daniel. I stared at it for several seconds. That was not possible. I distinctly remembered there being only one name earlier. I checked the handwriting, and both names looked identical, showing the same careful block letters. Trying to laugh it off, I placed the card back inside and locked the book in my office drawer. That was the end of it, or so I thought. After finishing the last of my shelving, I shut off the lights and headed toward the staff office to collect my things. The office door was open. I always closed it. Inside, the drawer I had locked was standing wide open, and the mysterious book was gone. I searched every shelf and every cart. Nothing. Assuming one of my co-workers had somehow come back into the building without me hearing them, I called out hello. Only silence answered. Then from somewhere deep in the basement, I heard a book cart rolling across the concrete floor. Slowly, very slowly, it stopped. A few seconds later came the unmistakable sound of a single book being placed carefully onto a shelf. I stood frozen. No one else should have been inside the building. For several seconds, I did not move. The sound had definitely come from the basement. It was not the heating system or the old pipes expanding. I had worked in that library long enough to recognize every normal noise the building made, and this was not one of them. The rolling book cart had made the unmistakable rattle of loose wheels crossing the uneven concrete floor, followed by the sound of a hardcover sliding onto a shelf. Someone was downstairs. My first thought was that one of the librarians had accidentally stayed behind. It had happened once before during inventory week. I called down the stairwell, asking if someone was still down there. Nothing. The silence stretched on for several moments. I called again, louder this time, but still received no response. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen showed almost no signal, which was not unusual inside the basement because of the thick concrete walls. I turned on the flashlight and slowly started downstairs. Each step creaked beneath my weight. The further I descended, the colder the air became. At the bottom of the stairs, my flashlight swept across rows of metal shelving, packed with old books, newspapers, and archive boxes. Everything appeared perfectly still. The book cart sat in the middle of the aisle, and one of its wheels was still slowly spinning. Someone had moved it only seconds earlier. I called hello again. Nothing. I walked farther into the archives. The beam from my flashlight bounced across faded labels and dusty shelves. Then I noticed something that made me stop. One section of books had been disturbed. Dozens of old volumes sat neatly in place, except for a single empty space, a rectangular gap, as though one book had just been removed. My heart started pounding. I looked down. Lying on the floor beneath the shelf was the white hardcover, the same mysterious book. I was absolutely certain it had not been downstairs earlier. I bent down and picked it up. It felt colder than everything around it. When I opened the cover, the checkout card slipped into my hand once again. There were now 3 names, Emily, Daniel, and beneath them, my own. Every letter matched my handwriting perfectly. I dropped the card. My pulse was racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. Someone had to be playing a sick joke. I grabbed the book and hurried back toward the stairs. Halfway there, the lights went out. The basement fell into complete darkness, and only my phone's flashlight remained. I instinctively spun around. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement near the far shelves. Not a clear figure, just someone stepping behind a row of archive boxes. I shouted, asking who was there. No answer. Instead, I heard another book being placed onto a shelf. Then another, then another. Each one carefully slid into place somewhere in the darkness. The sounds surrounded me from the left, the right, and behind me. It was impossible to tell where they were coming from. I did not wait to investigate. I ran. The wheels of the abandoned cart rattled as I brushed past it, and I practically flew up the staircase 2 steps at a time. The second I reached the main floor, every light in the building came back on. The sudden brightness was almost blinding. Breathing hard, I locked the basement door behind me. I did not care if someone was still down there. I just called the police. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes. I explained everything, fully expecting them to think I had imagined it. To their credit, they took me seriously. Together, we searched the basement from end to end. Every aisle, every storage room, every maintenance closet. No one was there. One of the officers eventually found something unusual near the back wall. Behind a movable shelving unit was a narrow maintenance corridor I had not known existed. It connected to an old exterior service entrance that had apparently been sealed years earlier. The rusted metal door was slightly open, and fresh footprints marked the dusty concrete floor. Someone had definitely been using the passage. The officers followed it outside. It led into a wooded area behind the library where the snow had already begun covering any tracks. Whoever had been inside was gone. The following morning, the library director asked me to come in early. She closed her office door before speaking. When I mentioned the mysterious book, her expression changed immediately. She asked me to describe it. A white cover, no barcode, an old checkout card, and the words Hawthorne County Library. She quietly opened a filing cabinet and removed a thin folder. Inside was a faded newspaper clipping from the early 1980s. According to the article, Hawthorne County Library had been a tiny private library that closed after a fire destroyed most of the building. Only a handful of books had ever been recovered, and no official records remained. I asked what happened to the rest, and she simply shrugged, saying no one knows. Then she said something even stranger, telling me I was not the first employee who had mentioned that book. Apparently, 3 former staff members had reported finding an unmarked white hardcover over the past 20 years. Each time it disappeared before anyone could figure out where it came from. No one had ever cataloged it. No one had ever checked it into the system, and somehow no one had ever managed to keep it. The library eventually renovated the basement. The hidden maintenance corridor was permanently sealed with concrete, and new security cameras were installed throughout the building. Nothing unusual happened again during the 2 years I continued working there. At least nothing that anyone reported. I left that job in 2020. A few months ago, I stopped by to return a novel I had borrowed. While chatting with one of the newer employees, I casually asked whether anything strange had ever happened in the archives. She laughed and pointed toward the returns cart, saying they got the weirdest donation yesterday. Sitting on top of the stack was a faded white hardcover with no barcode. I did not wait to see whether anyone opened it. I thanked her, walked out of the building, and drove home. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I had kept reading that checkout card instead of dropping it, because something tells me my name was not the last one written inside. If you had asked me a few years ago where I felt safest, I probably would have said a library. There is something comforting about being surrounded by thousands of books. Everyone speaks quietly, people keep to themselves, and the worst thing you normally have to deal with is someone forgetting to silence their phone. That opinion changed during the winter break of 2022. I was 23 years old and halfway through graduate school, studying information science. Money was tight, and when one of my professors mentioned that the university library needed temporary overnight assistance to help digitize decades of archived newspapers, I volunteered almost immediately. The work was not glamorous. Boxes of fragile newspapers dating back to the 1930s had to be scanned page by page before they deteriorated any further. The university wanted the project finished before the spring semester began, when thousands of students would once again fill the building. The overnight shift paid almost double the daytime rate. For someone trying to cover tuition, that was impossible to turn down. The library itself was one of the oldest buildings on campus. The original structure had been built in the early 1900s before several modern additions were attached over the decades. From the outside, it looked impressive, but inside it felt like several completely different buildings stitched together. You could walk through a brightly lit study area with modern furniture and glass walls, turn one corner, and suddenly find yourself in a narrow hallway lined with dark oak shelves that had not changed in nearly a century. The basement was where I spent almost every shift. It was not open to students, and most people did not even know it existed. Long climate-controlled rooms stretched beneath the building, packed with newspapers, university records, donated manuscripts, and shelves filled with books that had not been checked out in decades. The archives were surprisingly quiet. Not the normal kind of quiet, but the kind where you became aware of every tiny sound your own body made. Every breath seemed louder than it should have been, and even turning a newspaper page echoed through the room. There were 4 of us assigned to the digitization project. Maria supervised the archive department during the day. Ethan repaired damaged books before they were scanned. Joel handled most of the technical equipment, and then there was me. Because I preferred working late, I volunteered to cover the overnight scanning sessions alone after everyone else left. Maria walked me through everything on my first evening. She showed me how to operate the industrial scanners, how to log completed files, and where emergency exits were located. Before leaving, she pointed toward a thick steel door at the end of the archive hallway. Unlike every other room downstairs, this one required both a key and an electronic keypad. A faded sign above it simply read, "Archive Room C, closed for inventory." Maria told me I would not need anything in there. When I asked what was inside, she said it was mostly donated collections waiting to be cataloged. She smiled politely before adding that I should try not to worry if I heard noises from that direction. I laughed and asked what kind of noises, to which she shrugged and mentioned the building settles, old pipes, air pressure, or shelves shifting. Then she looked directly at me and told me whatever I do not prop that door open. The way she said it caught me off guard, not because it sounded threatening, but because it sounded practiced, like she had repeated the same sentence dozens of times before. I nodded and thought nothing more of it. The first week could not have been more ordinary. Every evening I would clock in around 6. The daytime staff would slowly disappear until only the overnight security officer remained somewhere upstairs. After 9, I had the entire archive floor to myself. I actually enjoyed it. I would put on instrumental music through one earbud and spend hours feeding newspapers into the scanner. The work became almost hypnotic to scan, label, save, and repeat. Around midnight, I would usually make coffee in the tiny employee break room before finishing another few boxes. Nothing unusual happened until the 8th night. I was scanning newspapers from 1968 when I realized one of the archive carts was missing. There were always 3, one for incoming material, one for completed boxes, and one left empty for transport. Now there were only 2. I searched the scanning room twice before assuming someone had borrowed it earlier. It was not important, so I grabbed another cart and kept working. About an hour later, I heard something that made me stop typing, a faint metallic squeak. It sounded exactly like the missing cart. The noise came from somewhere farther down the archive hallway. I removed my earbud and listened. A squeak, a pause, another squeak, and a pause. It was the unmistakable rhythm of old wheels turning. Someone had to still be downstairs. I walked into the hallway and every light was still on. The corridor stretched almost 100 feet before ending at the locked steel door Maria had warned me about. There was nobody there, and the hallway stood completely empty. I waited another minute, but nothing happened. Feeling slightly embarrassed, I returned to my desk. About 20 minutes later, the sound came back, only this time it was much closer. A squeak, a pause, a squeak, and a pause. The wheels sounded like they were moving just outside the scanning room. I stepped into the doorway so quickly I nearly knocked over a stack of newspapers. The hallway was empty again, except one of the archive carts now stood directly outside my room. I frowned, knowing for a fact it had not been there before. Curious, I walked over to it. The top shelf held a single hardback book, dark green, with no call number, no barcode, and no library markings whatsoever. Only a strip of masking tape was stretched across the front cover, with 3 words written in faded black marker stating "Return to Room C." I stared toward the locked steel door at the end of the hallway. It had not opened, and it could not have, because the keypad beside it still glowed red, showing the room remained secured. I picked up the book, and it was surprisingly heavy. As I turned it over in my hands, something slipped from between the pages and landed softly on the floor. It was not a bookmark, but a yellowed photograph. The picture showed 6 librarians standing together somewhere inside the archive basement, and judging by their clothes, it had probably been taken sometime in the late 1970s. 5 of them were smiling at the camera, but the 6th man stood slightly apart from the group with a blank expression. Someone had drawn a thick black X across his face, and written neatly on the back of the photograph were 7 words stating he never checked himself out. I suddenly became aware of how silent the basement had become. Even the ventilation system seemed to have stopped. Then somewhere behind the locked steel door, I heard the slow scrape of metal wheels rolling across concrete. A squeak, a pause, a squeak, and a pause. This time the sound was unmistakably coming from inside Archive Room C. I do not know how long I stood there staring at the steel door. The sound came again, a squeak, a pause, a squeak, and a pause. It was unmistakably the sound of one of those old archive carts rolling across the concrete floor on the other side. I kept telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe another employee had come in without me noticing, or maybe one of the maintenance workers had access. Trying to calm myself down, I picked up the phone at the scanning desk and called campus security. The overnight dispatcher answered almost immediately. I explained that I thought someone might still be working in the archive area after hours. He asked if I had actually seen anyone, and I admitted I had not, only heard something. After a short pause, he said he would send the patrol officer assigned to the library, and it would take around 15 minutes. That should have made me feel better, but instead, the silence seemed to grow heavier. I decided not to wait beside the locked door. Instead, I returned to the scanning room and tried to continue working. For almost 10 minutes, everything was quiet. Then the scanner suddenly stopped, and the computer displayed a simple error message stating connection lost. At the exact same moment, every overhead light flickered once. The emergency lights remained on, bathing the archive hallway in a dim yellow glow. My heart immediately started pounding. The backup generator usually kicked in within seconds, but this time it did not. The building felt strangely lifeless. I grabbed my flashlight from my backpack and stepped into the hallway. The steel door at the end of the corridor was still shut, but something was different. The keypad beside it no longer showed a red light, it was green. I stopped walking. I knew what I had seen earlier, and that light had definitely been red. Someone or something had unlocked the room. Before I could decide what to do, my radio crackled, and it was security saying I am downstairs. Relief washed over me. I hurried toward the entrance to the archive level and met Officer Daniels coming through the stairwell. He was probably in his 50s and had worked campus security for years. I explained everything from the missing cart to the photograph and the noises behind the door. He listened patiently without interrupting. When I finished, he smiled politely and said old buildings can play tricks on you. I expected that answer, but still I asked him to check room C with me. He agreed. Together we walked back down the hallway, and the green light was still glowing beside the door. Daniels frowned and muttered, "That is odd." He pulled a ring of keys from his belt, and one key fit the lock. The heavy steel door opened with a long groan. The room beyond was enormous, much larger than I had imagined. Tall, mobile shelving units stretched into the darkness, and rows of old boxes disappeared beyond the reach of our flashlights. Dust drifted lazily through the air, and it smelled like old paper and damp wood. Nothing appeared disturbed. Daniel slowly swept his flashlight across the room and said, "No one is here." Then I noticed something, fresh wheel marks. They crossed the dusty floor between the shelves, meaning someone had definitely moved an archive cart recently. I pointed them out, and Daniels crouched beside them, calling it interesting. The tracks disappeared deeper into the room, so we followed them carefully. About halfway through the storage area, we found the missing cart. It stood perfectly centered between two shelving units, empty except for the same green book. I could have sworn I had left it on my desk. Daniels looked confused and noted, "You said this was outside." I told him it was. He picked it up and flipped through the pages, but almost every page was blank. Near the back, however, one folded sheet of paper had been tucked inside. He unfolded it, and his expression changed immediately. I asked what it was, and he hesitated before saying, "It is an old checkout record." He handed it to me, and it listed dozens of books borrowed over several decades. The final entry caught my attention, listing employee number 1147, with the status stating not returned. There was no name, only a date, February 3rd, 1978. Before either of us could say anything else, a loud metallic crash echoed somewhere deeper inside the room. We both spun toward the sound. One of the shelving aisles had gone dark, and our flashlight beams barely reached it. Daniels called out campus security, but no answer came, only silence. Then a squeak, a pause, a squeak, and a pause. The cartwheels were moving again, only now they were moving away from us. Daniels started after the sound, and I followed a few steps behind. The deeper we walked, the colder the room became. Eventually, the tracks ended at the back wall. There was nowhere else to go. No exits, no hidden doorway, nothing. It was just shelves filled with forgotten records. Daniel slowly turned in a full circle and muttered, "That is impossible." Then my flashlight caught something mounted high on the wall, a faded black and white staff photograph. I stepped closer, and it was the same picture I had found inside the green book. 6 employees, 5 smiling, and 1 standing slightly apart. Except there was not an X over his face anymore. The photograph looked untouched. I looked back down at the copy still lying inside the book, and the X was gone from that one too. Neither of us said a word. At that exact moment, every light in the archive suddenly came back on. The computer systems rebooted upstairs, and the radio on Daniel's shoulder crackled with another guard asking if everything was okay. He answered yes without taking his eyes off the photograph. We left room C together, and Daniels locked the steel door behind us. Before leaving for the night, he quietly asked if he could keep the checkout record. A week later, I came back for another shift. Room C had been sealed with a heavy chain across the handles, and a printed notice read "Authorized personnel only." I asked Maria what had happened, and she looked surprised, asking if I thought they told me. When I asked what they were supposed to tell me, she glanced toward the chained door before lowering her voice, saying years ago, one of the archive employees disappeared during an overnight inventory. I waited for her to continue, and she said they searched the building for days, but never found him. She slowly shook her head and added the strange part was not that he disappeared. It was that every inventory record listed him as still being checked into the archive. She gave an awkward smile, clearly regretting bringing it up, and said they eventually stopped talking about it. That was my final week working nights. I transferred to a daytime research position before the semester started, and I never asked to go back into the basement. Months later, I looked through the university's digital archive while researching another project. Out of curiosity, I searched for the missing employee from 1978. There were no articles, no memorial, and no investigation. Nothing. It was as if he had never existed. The only thing I ever found was a scanned inventory sheet buried in an old maintenance report. Most people would have ignored it. But at the bottom, beside hundreds of catalog numbers, one handwritten note had been added in fading blue ink. It simply read, "Archive Room C inventory complete. One item still awaiting return." When I was a sophomore in high school, there was a student everyone avoided. It wasn't because he was loud or aggressive. In fact, he barely spoke at all. What unsettled people was how he carried himself, like he was always watching something nobody else could see. I'll call him Evan. That wasn't his real name, but after everything that happened, I'd rather keep his identity buried in the past. This all took place in a quiet town outside Asheville, North Carolina. It was one of those places where rumors spread faster than facts, and Evan was at the center of more stories than anyone else. He always wore the same oversized charcoal sweatshirt, regardless of the weather, with the hood pulled low and dark sunglasses covering his eyes. Evan rarely spoke unless someone spoke directly to him, and even then, his answers were short and almost rehearsed. But what people remembered most was what he claimed to be. Evan genuinely believed, or wanted everyone else to believe, that he wasn't entirely human. He'd quietly tell people he had crossed over, or insist there were things following him that nobody else could see. Despite keeping to himself, Evan had an odd habit. Every so often, he'd choose someone. He'd walk up to them between classes, look them directly in the face, and calmly say, "You're under my protection now." Then he'd walk away like nothing had happened. People started jokingly calling it being marked. I happened to be one of them. Looking back, I think he simply had a crush on me. But my friends Emma, Natalie, and Tyler found the whole thing hilarious. Every lunch period, they'd tease me about having a guardian spirit. I laughed along with them. But secretly, there was always something about Evan that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Every time I caught him looking in my direction, it felt like he'd been staring long before I've noticed. One afternoon, the 4 of us were sitting behind the baseball field after school, leaning against the dugout and talking about school drama. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward Evan. Emma started joking about how he always seemed to appear wherever I was, and Natalie laughed, saying maybe he had some supernatural GPS. Tyler rolled his eyes, saying we were giving the guy too much credit. Without realizing it, we'd said his name 3 separate times in less than a minute. Tyler was halfway through another joke when he suddenly stopped talking. His face drained of color. I followed his gaze upward. Standing on top of the dugout roof was Evan. None of us had heard footsteps. No one had seen him approach. 1 second, the roof had been empty, and the next, he was just there. He wasn't holding anything, and he wasn't smiling. He simply stood with his hood pulled low, staring silently down at us. Just watching. I forced an awkward smile and gave him a small wave. After several long seconds, he slowly nodded once, and then he stepped backward. We rushed around the dugout expecting to see where he'd gone, but the area behind it was completely empty. There was nowhere he could have disappeared that quickly. Tyler insisted he must have jumped down the opposite side and taken off running, which sounded reasonable enough. Even so, something about it didn't sit right with me. A few weeks later, Emma invited me over to her house. We spent the afternoon working on homework upstairs before eventually talking about school instead. Somehow the conversation circled back to Evan. Emma joked that maybe he secretly listened through the classroom vents. I told her to stop because she was creeping me out, but she laughed and said his name again. I answered without thinking, and a few minutes later, Emma casually said it one last time. Maybe 8 or 9 minutes passed. Then we heard the front door open downstairs. We heard voices in the hallway, and then her mother called upstairs. "Emma, someone's here asking for you." When we reached the bottom of the stairs, there he was, Evan, standing calmly inside the entryway. His hoodie was dripping with rain, even though the forecast had been clear all afternoon. Emma's mom looked more confused than alarmed, asking if he needed something. Without changing his expression, he answered quietly, "I thought someone wanted me here." The room instantly felt colder. Emma grabbed my arm so tightly it hurt. Her mother awkwardly thanked him for stopping by before explaining we were busy. Evan simply nodded, turned around, opened the front door, and left without another word. The second the door closed, Emma whispered exactly what I had been thinking. We said his name. By the following Monday, we told Tyler and Natalie everything. Neither of them laughed this time. We made an unofficial agreement that morning none of us would casually mention Evan anymore, especially not more than once during the same conversation. Life returned to normal for a while, until a Friday evening at Tyler's house. His parents were away for the night, so a handful of us gathered in his backyard around the fire pit. A few newer friends had joined us, including a guy named Dylan. Dylan noticed that every time someone started talking about odd kids from school, the rest of us immediately changed the subject. He caught on faster than we expected, asking what we were avoiding. Eventually, Tyler gave in and told him everything. The baseball field, Emma's house, and the strange timing. Dylan laughed so hard he nearly dropped his drink, mocking us for believing it. "So if I say his name 3 times? Dylan smirked. "Don't," Emma interrupted immediately. "I'm serious." Dylan grinned, leaned back in his chair, and deliberately repeated Evan's name 3 times in one sentence. When nothing happened, he threw his hands in the air. "See, I told you." 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Nothing. Eventually, everyone relaxed, and Tyler rolled his eyes, admitting we really did let ourselves get freaked out. Just then, the music stopped. The Bluetooth speaker still showed power, but the song had cut off mid-note. Nobody had touched it. Before Tyler could even finish asking what happened, Natalie slowly looked toward the wooden privacy fence that surrounded the backyard. "Guys," her voice was barely a whisper. Someone was standing on the opposite side of the fence, not inside the yard, but just visible through the narrow gap between 2 fence panels. A motionless silhouette watching us. The figure remained perfectly still, and then, without a sound, it stepped sideways until it disappeared from view. Dylan immediately stood up and walked toward the side gate to see who it was. But when he pulled it open, the sidewalk outside was completely empty. The nearest streetlight illuminated the entire block, and there wasn't a single person in sight. Dylan came back looking far less confident than before. After that night, nobody in our group brought up Evan again. The final incident happened near the end of summer. My parents had gone out to celebrate their anniversary, leaving me home alone for the evening. I invited a guy I'd recently started seeing over to watch movies named Mason. He was the kind of person who thought every ghost story was automatically fake. About halfway through the movie, we started talking about strange kids we'd gone to school with. Before I could stop him, Mason asked, "So whatever happened to that guy? Evan?" I immediately tensed, asking to talk about something else. He laughed, teasing me for being nervous. And before I could say anything, he loudly repeated Evan's name. Once, twice, 3 times. The room became completely silent, and before I could answer his smug grin, every light in the house went out. The television screen went black. Outside, thunder cracked so loudly it rattled the windows, and rain slammed against the roof only seconds later. It hadn't even been cloudy when he'd arrived. I walked upstairs toward my bedroom to grab a flashlight from my desk. As I reached the window, lightning illuminated the front yard. For a fraction of a second, I saw someone standing near the sidewalk, motionless, facing the house. Then another flash came, closer this time. "Mason," I called out. He hurried upstairs, and as another flash of lightning struck, we both saw it. A hooded figure, standing perfectly still, looking directly at the second-floor window. The next clap of thunder shook the entire house, and when we looked back, the yard was empty. That's when we heard 3 slow knocks coming from the front door. Knock, knock, knock. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then came 3 more knocks, exactly the same. Slow, deliberate, impatient. Mason grabbed the flashlight from my desk and switched it on, and we carefully made our way downstairs. When we reached the front hallway, we stood frozen. Whoever had knocked wasn't trying to force their way inside. They were simply waiting. "I'm going to look through the peephole," Mason whispered. He leaned toward the door, and after only a second, he jerked backward. There's nobody there. The porch is empty. Eventually, Mason unlocked the deadbolt just enough to crack the door open a few inches. The porch, the driveway, and the street beyond were completely deserted. No footprints, no movement, nothing. The next morning, the storm had passed. After Mason drove away, I walked around the outside of the house. Near the back fence, I noticed a dark gray hoodie, the same kind Evan always wore, folded neatly. With shaking hands, I nudged it open using a long tree branch. Wrapped inside were several small objects, an old friendship bracelet I'd lost months earlier, a silver keychain from my backpack, and a blue hair clip I thought had fallen out of my gym bag. None of them were valuable, but every one of them had disappeared at different times over the previous school year. I called my parents, and we contacted the local police. An officer came by, photographed the hoodie, and collected the belongings. Monday morning, Evan wasn't at school. Tuesday came, and still nothing. By the end of the week, rumors were spreading that his family had moved overnight, or that he'd been admitted to a treatment facility. Teachers refused to discuss it, and the principal only said Evan would not be returning. That was the last official mention of him. Looking back as an adult, I think the most realistic answer is that Evan was a deeply troubled young man who became fixated on me. He learned our schedules. He knew where we spent our time, and he listened when we weren't paying attention. The coincidences only felt supernatural because we never noticed how closely we were being watched. Honestly, that explanation frightens me more than anything paranormal ever could, because it means there was never any magic involved. Just someone hiding in plain sight, someone who knew far more about our lives than we ever knew about his. I've always trusted my instincts. That doesn't mean they're always right, but there have been enough moments in my life where listening to that uneasy feeling has kept me out of trouble. Most people call it intuition. My grandfather used to call it the whisper. He'd always say, if something feels wrong before you know why, don't wait around looking for proof. I never really appreciated what he meant until one winter evening a few years ago. At the time, I was living just outside Bozeman, Montana, and my friend Ryan had invited me to a small dinner party at one of his co-workers' homes. It was supposed to be a relaxing Saturday night good food, a few drinks, and an excuse to get out of the apartment after a long week. The forecast had called for light snow, nothing unusual. By late afternoon, though, the weather had changed its mind. Fat snowflakes drifted across the windshield as we left town, coating everything in fresh white. It wasn't a blizzard yet, but visibility was beginning to shrink. On the way, Ryan suggested we stop at a local market to pick up something for the hosts. We grabbed a few bottles of sparkling cider, a dessert tray, and some locally roasted coffee. The farther we drove from town, the heavier the snowfall became. Streetlights grew farther apart. The roads narrowed. Soon we were winding through quiet neighborhoods where every house looked tucked beneath a blanket of white. The truck wasn't handling the icy roads very well. Every few minutes, the tires slipped just enough to make my pulse jump. Ryan reached over and turned the music down. "You know," he said, "this almost feels peaceful." I looked around. Snow covered everything. Trees, mailboxes, parked cars. The entire neighborhood had gone strangely quiet. Almost too quiet. Then we rounded a bend. About 50 yards ahead sat a dark SUV in the middle of the road. Its hazard lights blinked steadily through the falling snow. Orange, darkness, orange, darkness. Both front doors were standing wide open. No one was inside. No one was nearby. The engine appeared to still be running. I immediately eased off the gas. "What happened?" Ryan asked. "Maybe someone slid off the road," I suggested. "Then where are they?" The truck rolled to a slow stop a safe distance away. For several long seconds, we simply watched. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No voices. No sign of anyone needing help. "Should we check on them?" Ryan asked. "I don't know," I replied. "It could be an emergency. It could also be something else." The truth was, I couldn't explain it. There wasn't anything obviously wrong. No broken windows. No smoke. No crash damage. Just an abandoned vehicle sitting perfectly straight in the middle of the road. It felt staged. "If somebody's hurt," Ryan began. He opened his door before I could stop him. "I'll just take a quick look." "Ryan, I'll be 30 seconds. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he slowly approached the SUV. I stayed behind the wheel with my foot resting on the brake. Every instinct I had screamed that we shouldn't be there. Ryan reached the driver's door and carefully looked inside. Then, something caught my attention. It wasn't movement. It was the rear of the SUV. For just an instant, I thought I saw the back end dip slightly, almost as if weight had shifted inside. Then I noticed something else. A fresh set of footprints leading away from the road, toward a stand of snow-covered pine trees. Not away from the vehicle, toward the trees. My pulse immediately spiked. Those prints hadn't been there long. Someone had walked into those woods only moments before, but no footprints came back out. I slammed my hand against the horn. The loud blast shattered the silence. Ryan spun around. I rolled down my window. "Get back here, now!" The urgency in my voice was enough. He started jogging back through the snow. As he reached the truck, I locked the doors and shifted into reverse. "Look," I pointed toward the trees. He followed the line of footprints. His expression changed instantly. I backed the truck around the curve and drove away as carefully and as quickly as the icy road allowed. Neither of us looked back. When we finally arrived at the dinner party, warm light and laughter spilled from the house. It felt normal. But Ryan quickly breaks the silence after everyone finishes exchanging winter driving stories. "You should tell them." I described the empty SUV, the open doors, and the footprints. The room grew noticeably quieter. Some guests shrugged it off as nothing. Then the homeowner's older brother spoke. He calmly set down his coffee mug. "I worked search and rescue for almost 12 years. There are situations where helping immediately is the right thing to do. And there are situations where the safest thing you can do is call for help from a distance. Did anything about that vehicle seem intentional?" I nodded. He didn't smile. "You probably trusted the right instinct." A few hours later, the homeowner switched on the television. A local news station anchor interrupted the forecast with breaking news. A photograph of a dark SUV appeared on the screen. State police were searching for individuals connected to multiple roadside incidents where disabled vehicles were used to lure motorists into stopping. Hidden accomplices would emerge from nearby wooded areas once victims exited their vehicles. Some victims had been robbed, others had their vehicles stolen. Earlier that evening, officers had located the same SUV, but the suspects had already fled. The homeowner muted the television. Driving home later that night felt completely different. Every parked car, every shadow, every stretch of dark roadside suddenly seemed capable of hiding someone. People often imagine dangerous situations as dramatic moments where everything is obviously wrong. In reality, sometimes the only warning you get is a feeling you can't explain. I've learned there's a difference between being kind and walking straight into someone else's trap. Some childhood memories fade with time. Others become sharper. The older I get, the more vividly I remember one particular summer, even though I wish I could forget it entirely. I was 10 years old and my family spent nearly every school vacation at my grandparents' lake house in northern Minnesota. It sat on several wooded acres overlooking a quiet stretch of water, far enough from town that the nights were almost completely silent. To me, it was paradise. My father came from a huge family. There were usually 20 or 30 people staying at the property throughout the summer. The adults rotated weekends depending on work schedules, while the kids treated the place like our own little world. There was one relative everyone seemed especially happy to see whenever he arrived. I'll call him Uncle Daniel. He wasn't actually my uncle by blood. He'd married one of my mother's cousins years before, but everyone simply called him Uncle Daniel. He had a calm voice, endless patience, and an uncanny ability to make every child feel important. The adults admired him because he worked as a licensed child psychologist. To 10-year-old me, he seemed like the smartest adult in the world. I trusted him completely. That summer, something strange started happening. It began with dreams, not ordinary nightmares. These felt painfully real. Each one centered on losing something I loved. Sometimes I'd dream my parents packed up the car and drove away without me. After several nights like that, my parents noticed something was wrong. I told them I was just having bad dreams. They assumed I'd outgrow them. I didn't want to worry them. Instead, I went to Uncle Daniel. He listened carefully while I explained every nightmare I could remember. Unlike most adults, he didn't interrupt. He simply nodded occasionally while writing notes in a small leather journal he carried almost everywhere. When I finished, he smiled reassuringly. "Dreams usually mean something," he said. "They're trying to tell you something you're afraid to admit." Before I left, he asked me one unusual question. "Has anyone ever made you feel invisible?" I thought for a moment and said no. He smiled. "Interesting." Then he changed the subject completely. For a day or two, the nightmares stopped, but then they came back. Only this time they were worse. Instead of simply being alone, people in my dreams began ignoring me completely. I'd scream for my parents while they walked straight past me. My cousins would laugh together without noticing I was standing beside them. A few days later, I found Uncle Daniel sitting alone on the back porch reading. I told him they were getting worse. He sighed softly. "I think I know why. I think a part of you is trying very hard to be noticed." He tapped the cover of his journal. "For the next few days, pay attention to how people react to you. If someone asks you to do something, try saying no once in a while. Just once. See how it makes you feel." At 10 years old, I never questioned his advice. The next morning, my mom asked me to help set the breakfast table. Instead, I quietly said, "I don't want to." She looked at me surprised and asked if I was feeling okay. Almost immediately, I felt guilty. By dinner that evening, my parents had clearly noticed something was different. That night, the nightmares returned. This time, I dreamed I was standing in the middle of the lake, and every member of my family watched me silently from the dock. I begged them to help. None of them moved. They turned around and walked back into the house. The conversations with Uncle Daniel continued every single night. Everything stayed between us. A week later, I found him sitting alone in one of the upstairs guest rooms. His leather journal lay open on the bedside table. He stepped into the hallway just as I reached the doorway. "I'll be right back," he said, and disappeared downstairs. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the journal. Most of the pages were covered in neat handwriting. Dates, observations, questions. Some pages listed names I recognized. My cousins, other relatives. Eventually, I found my own name. My stomach tightened. The first few entries described my nightmares. Then the pages became stranger. Subject responds well to reassurance. Increasing dependence observed. Trust remains exceptionally high. Then I reached the newest page. There, written neatly across the top, was a sentence I'll never forget. Subject is beginning to question his own memories. Progress is encouraging. A cold chill ran through my body. I wasn't reading therapy notes. I was reading observations, like someone watching an experiment. Before I could turn another page, I heard footsteps coming back down the hallway. I barely had time to close the journal before Uncle Daniel stepped back into the room. Our eyes met. He knew exactly what I'd been doing. He smiled. "You found my notes. Those notes aren't meant for children." He picked up the journal and tucked it beneath his arm. "And I don't think you'll mention them to anyone." That evening, as everyone began heading inside for the night, Uncle Daniel quietly caught my attention. "Would you walk down to the dock with me for a minute?" I hesitated, but I followed him. The lake was perfectly still. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, he looked out across the dark water. "Have the dreams changed again?" "A little. I thought they might." He opened the journal. "You've started doubting your own memories. You noticed that, didn't you? I read one page." "I know," his voice remained calm. "I left it where you could find it. I was curious whether you'd look. People reveal far more about themselves when they think nobody's watching." I took a small step backward. "I want to go back. In a minute. You trust me more than your parents." "No, I think you do." I suddenly realized something horrifying. None of it had been about helping me. He'd been testing me, seeing how easily he could influence what I thought. I turned around and started running back toward the house. He calmly called after me, "If you tell anyone, they'll assume you misunderstood." By the time I reached the porch, I was crying so hard I could barely speak. Everything came pouring out. The nightmares, the conversations, the journal, every single detail. My father stood up without saying a word. Several family members followed him toward the dock. By the time they reached the shoreline, my father demanded the journal. Daniel refused. An argument broke out. Eventually, my grandfather took the journal from Daniel's hands. The adults spent nearly an hour reading through every page. I remember the expressions on their faces: shock, confusion, and eventually, anger. The next morning, Uncle Daniel was gone. His car, his luggage, everything. Years later, my father finally told me what had happened. The journal contained detailed observations about dozens of children over several years. How easily they trusted adults. How quickly they questioned their own memories when given repeated suggestions. None of the notes described treatment. They described behavior, like someone documenting experiments. The family reported everything to the authorities. Investigators later searched Daniel's office and discovered boxes of journals nearly identical to the one from the lake house. His professional license was permanently revoked. After that, he disappeared from our lives. People often ask what frightened me most about that summer. It wasn't the nightmares. It wasn't finding my name in his journal. It was something much simpler. Every adult in my family believed Uncle Daniel was the safest person in the room. So did I. The truth is, the most dangerous people rarely look dangerous. Sometimes they earn your trust one kind word at a time. And by the time you realize they've been studying you, they already know exactly how your mind works.